So, I'm doing research on Calvin Coolidge, and I come across the Immigration Act of 1924. I've come across it before, and every time I have read where it was the most racist, xenophobic immigration act the United States has ever passed, okay? And at the time, I didn't look into the why. It wasn't until our most recent series, Presidents and Civil Rights, that I found out about the why, okay? And yeah, buckle up because I'm about to tell you. So, some quick background, okay? And quick background as in previous immigration acts or attempts at immigration acts, okay? The Naturalization Act of 1790 was the first major immigration law in the United States. The law limited naturalization to free white persons of good character, excluding Native Americans, indentured servants, enslaved people, free Africans, Pacific Islanders, and non-white Asians. The courts associated whiteness with Christianity, so Muslim immigrants were also excluded from citizenship until about 1940. Eligibility would be extended to people of African descent in the Naturalization Act of 1870. Chinese women would be excluded in 1875 with the Page Act. Chinese laborers would be barred from immigrating in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Japanese would agree to deny immigration passports or limit immigration passports in the Gentlemen's Agreement Act of 1907. But I'm not done. What is it? 1891 Immigration Act barred polygamists, people with contagious diseases, people convicted of crimes of moral turpitude, and those likely to become a public charge by depending on government assistance. A 1903 law barred anarchists and others, including beggars. Still, the vast majority of Europeans who reached the United States were granted entry. The U.S. Immigration Service excluded only 1% of the 25 million Europeans who arrived between 1880 and World War I. Okay? The Immigration Act of 1917 increased restrictions of Asian immigrants, excluded those deemed to be diseased or mentally unwell, and introduced the literacy test for all new immigrants to prove their ability to read English. Do you see a trend? Yeah? Good. Because I want to make sure we're all on the same page, okay? The first 2 decades of the 1900s brought the highest levels of immigration to the country, okay, with 14.5 million people arriving from fiscal year 1900 to fiscal year 1919. In 1900, 16% of the U.S. foreign-born population was from Eastern Europe. So we're talking Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Bosnia, okay? Or Southern Europe, and that's Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, okay? By 1920, their share had more than doubled to 41%. By 1924, it was decided that those particular immigrants, in addition to Asians and Africans, were no longer ideal. Yeah. Then along comes U.S. Representatives Albert Johnson and, Senator David Reed, both of whom were eugenicists. Yeah. The Immigration Act of 1924 was the brainchild of eugenicists U.S. Representative Albert Johnson and Senator David Reed. For the first time, eugenicists played an important role in the congressional debate as expert advisors on the threat of inferior stock from Eastern and Southern Europe. American eugenicists tended to believe in the genetic superiority of Nordic, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon peoples, supported strict immigration and anti-miscegenation laws, and supported the forcible sterilization of the poor, disabled, and immoral. They believed that immigrants were often degenerate, had low IQs, and were afflicted with shiftlessness, alcoholism, and insubordination. They also viewed Southern and Eastern Europeans, specifically Jews, as genetically inferior. Yeah. Eugenicists wanted to limit immigration of those considered less racially desirable. So, on one hand, you've got eugenicists writing the Immigration Act. On the other hand, you have lobbyists from the West Coast, where a majority of Japanese, Korean, and other East Asian immigrants have settled, and where they were especially concerned with excluding Asian immigrants. They wanted to exclude them completely. Yeah. Because don't forget, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Gentlemen's Agreement had slowed down Asian immigration, but only of the Chinese and the Japanese. Korean and Filipino laborers had begun to arrive and were putting down roots. And then, of course, you had the KKK, putting on their little cheerleader outfits and picking at the pom-poms, and they were on the sidelines rooting everybody on. Yeah. So, let's talk about the specifics of the Immigration Act of 1924. The 1924 Act prevented immigration from Asia as well as Africa. The research never mentions Africa, but it restricted immigration from Africa. The majority of immigration had already been banned from China, restricted or banned from Japan, but now it included countries like Korea. Okay. It restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. So that included countries like Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Bosnia, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. Okay. It also updated the quota system. Okay. The 1924 Act set a quota system with the explicit goal of rewinding the country's racial and ethnic mix to a time dominated by Western and Northern European immigration, white people. Reed, a eugenicist and one of the lead sponsors, wrote in the New York Times that with the bill's passage, the composition of our population will not change in the future decade like it did in the same way in which it changed between 1885 and the outbreak of the World War, meaning not so many people coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, not so many Italians, not so many Jewish people. That's what he's saying. More white people will be coming to the United States. That's what he's saying. He's saying that the United States would then become a more homogeneous nation and a vastly better place to live in. That's code for white. And let's talk about the updated quota system, okay? We're going to do a compare and contrast between 1921 and 1924, okay? In 1921, Eastern and Southern European countries were given 41% of the annual slots. In 1924, those same countries were given 15% of the annual slots. Okay, so again, we're talking Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Bosnia, etc. 1921 quotas for Northern and Western European countries and those who had education or a trade were allocated 59%. This was in 1921. Those same countries, 1924, they were given 85%. 85%. Now, you'll notice that Asians and African descent, Africa, they were given 0%. Now, for Asians, that was intentional, right? They were banned. For Africans, that was because they were going off of like an 1890 and a 19 census, and blacks were not included in the 1920 census. So they were like, we're not going to include you now. The quota system with the 15% meant that Jewish people were being turned away during World War II during the rise of Hitler until 1943. Hebrew was a racial category in the American immigration law. Between 1939 and 1940, more than 50% of all immigrants to the United States identified themselves as Jewish, but this is likely a low number since some refugees probably selected a different category, such as German, which they were given 85%, or did not consider themselves Jewish even if the Nazis did. American popular opinion was against accepting more new arrivals. A Gallup poll taken on November 24th through the 25th, 1938, 2 weeks after the essay and the Hitler Youth shattered windows of about 7,500 Jewish stores and businesses and ransacked Jewish homes. It's referred to as the Night of Broken Glass. They asked Americans, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% said no. The Immigration Act of 1924 shaped the U.S. population over the course of the 20th century, greatly restricting immigration and ensuring that arriving immigrants were mostly from Northern and Western Europe. It closed the door on almost all new Asian and African immigration and shut out most European Jews and other refugees fleeing fascism and the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe. One of the most restrictive immigration laws in U.S. history. It played a key role in ending the previous era of largely unrestricted immigration. The 1924 law set the framework for policies that remain cornerstones of U.S. immigration law today. Numerical limits on annual immigration, the ability to deport unauthorized immigrants no matter how long they have been in the United States, and the need for people to seek visas and meet other requirements before they reach the United States soil.